So in today's web dev tip, I'm going to show you how you can initialize your new JavaScript project as a Git repository. So first of all, we're going to set up our project as a Git repository, and then we're going to make sure that we've got any files and folders that we don't want to include in our repository ignored. And then finally, we'll make an initial commit just to get our working directory clean. So if you're not too familiar with Git, I'll try and go through some of the basics for you, but you will need to have it installed on your local development machine. And I'll put some links in the description below on how you can get sorted out with that. But what we're going to do is actually initialize this simple project that we created in a previous tutorial as a Git repository. So to do that, we simply say git init. And within Visual Studio Code, what happens now is we can actually see in the left-hand side the files and folders that are going to be tracked within the Git repository. So at the moment, there's a little U next to these files here because they're actually untracked, so we haven't actually added them into the repository, and we'll come on to that in just a moment. But just to show you what that's done, that git init command, it's basically created a new folder, which we can see if we say ls-a called .git. And that is a new folder that holds all of the Git information for tracking files and changes within your project. But we don't need to worry too much about that folder at the moment, just to demonstrate that it's there. And before we make our first initial commit, what we want to do is make sure that we're ignoring our node modules folder, because we don't actually want to include all of the dependencies that we've got in our project. So we've installed Axios as one of the dependencies. So we don't want to include that in our repository, because as node modules grows bigger and bigger, we'll be including lots more files that we don't really need to include. So what we're going to do is set up a new file here, and it's just a dot file, which is .git ignore. And this is a special Git file which we can put in file names and file paths and folder names, which will be ignored by the Git system. So for example, if we want to ignore node modules, we simply say node_modules in Git ignore. And you can see in Visual Studio Code now that the node modules folder is now grayed out, which basically means it's not being tracked anymore. And we can verify what is being tracked if we look in the left-hand side here in the source control tab in Visual Studio Code. We can see here these are the changes that Git knows about from the files that we've added into our repository and the changes that we've made to them. And you can use the built-in tools in Visual Studio Code to actually manage the changes that you've made, to actually commit them and save them. But I'm going to show you how to do it on the command line, but you'll see the changes being updated here in the left-hand panel. Okay, so what we want to do is commit the files that we've got, our package.json, our package lock, and our git ignore file into the Git repository. So to do that, we've used the git add command. So we say git add. And to add all of those files, we could name them one by one, but it's quicker to just do all of them in one go. We say git add and then a full stop or period. And if we run that git add command, what you'll see on the left-hand side now is that the files that we had changes in are now in a staged state, which means they're ready to be committed. So there's kind of a two-stage process for doing this with Git. You first of all need to stage the changes that you want to commit into the repository, and once you're happy with the changes that you've got staged, you then make a commit and say these are the changes that I want to be stored in the Git repository. So we do that with another Git command, which is git commit, and you always need to supply a message with your commit as well. So if we pass in -m, and then you can just put any text in here that you'd like, which describes the changes that you're making. So we could say something like initial commit, which is quite common when you're first setting up your project. And if we hit enter, you see we get some output in the terminal here, and also those changes have now disappeared within our Visual Studio Code browser. So what that's done is taken our three files and committed them into the Git repository and part of the history, so we can go back and check that if we need to at a later point, or we can revert back to that point in time if we need to undo any changes that we've made. So that's just a quick introduction to getting your project set up as a Git repository and making your first commit. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.